Thank you. I want to talk to you about sex, about the history of sexual freedom. And I'm going to start with a question from me to all of you in the audience here. It's a simple question. If the answer is yes, please just put up your hand. All right, here it is. Have you ever had sex with another person without being married to them? Okay, let's see. Okay, very interesting. A lot of hands going down very quickly again, yes. But I saw it, and I think that shows two things. Shows that quite a lot of people here have, mainly in the central area here. But more importantly, that was an odd moment, wasn't it? That was a bit strange. You weren't expecting that. And that you weren't expecting to have to answer that question in public, surrounded by hundreds of strangers. And that's because nowadays in the Western world, we think of sex as something quintessentially private. Sexual freedom and sexual privacy are things that we take completely for granted. They're central to our culture in all sorts of ways. And everyone can see that in the modern world today, if you look around the world, Western attitudes to sex are very distinctive. For example, if we look elsewhere, we think it wrong that in some other cultures, for example, the discussion of sex is censored, or that people suffer for their sexual orientation, that women are treated as second-class citizens, or indeed that there are places where men and women are publicly executed for adultery. But our own society used to be rather like that too, because for most of Western history, sex was not a private matter. Indeed, to have sex with another person, except within marriage, was a public crime. And let me give you an example of what that might mean. 400 years ago, in March 1612, a man and a woman were arrested in London. Their names were Susan Perry and Robert Watson. And their crime was simply that they'd had sex together without being married, and they'd conceived a child. So for this, they're put on trial. A jury of 12 men is summoned. They're interrogated, and very quickly, they're found guilty. And for this terrible crime, the judges sentence them to be forever expelled from the society in which they live. And this picture is a contemporary illustration that shows what happens to them. Straight away, the moment they're convicted, they are taken to the local prison, and there they're stripped naked down to the waist. And they're both tied with their hands to the back of a cart. And then the cart begins to move, and it drags them along, drags them through the main streets of their city. And whilst they're being dragged along like this, a man walks behind them with a whip, lashing their backs until they're raw and bloody and dripping with blood. And as they're dragged along, they go through the main streets of their city for 20 minutes, half an hour, and the neighbors come out and they pelt things at them and they jeer and they shout abuse, because this is a parade of public humiliation until they get to the edge of the city, and there they're cut loose and dumped by the side of the road. But that wasn't their real punishment. Their real punishment begins then. Their real punishment is that they are now cut off forever from their friends, their families, their livelihoods, from everything they know. They may never set foot in their hometown again. Now, if you look at the historical record, as I have, you can find easily thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of stories like this. This is a particularly nasty example. But this kind of treatment was a completely ordinary occurrence anywhere in the Christian world at any point until the 18th century. Every day, men and women were punished. They were arrested, fined, flogged, imprisoned, publicly humiliated for having sex without being married. Now, this was the law. It was the law of the church and the law of the state. But it only worked because ordinary people, the whole community, put huge efforts into enforcing it. And it seemed obvious to most people that this was a very important thing to do because illicit sex was extremely dangerous to the whole community. And it was dangerous for two main reasons. The first was that most people took for granted that illicit sex caused huge social problems. It caused crime, it spread disorder, it spread disease, it broke up families. Allowing people to do what they liked sexually, it seemed, was inevitably going to lead to sexual chaos and anarchy, and social chaos and anarchy. And the second reason was that everyone knew that sex outside marriage made God very angry. And the Bible seemed very clear about this. God would punish not just the sinners themselves, but the entire community that tolerated such behavior, the village or the city or the entire nation. Just as God had punished Sodom and Gomorrah, he would destroy any place that tolerated sexual license. So the pre-modern ideal is not sexual freedom, but sexual restraint and self-control and sexual discipline for individuals, but also for whole communities. Now, in practice, this system of sexual discipline was very biased and very imperfect. Lots of people did have sex without being married. Here are two of them. But we can measure that actually over the centuries, people have less and less illicit sex. And that's because the system of sexual discipline is getting more intense and more successful over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And by the 1650s, there are many places in Europe and in North America where Christian societies have made adultery punishable by death. The last person to be executed for adultery in England was a woman called Susan Bounty in 1654. Now, when Susan Bounty was convicted, she was pregnant. She was carrying a child. And so, humanely, the judges let her live on in prison until she'd given birth. And then, when she'd given birth, they took her baby from her and they paraded her to the scaffold and they hanged her from her neck until she was dead. So that is the kind of world that we've left behind in the West. It was changed forever 300 years ago by what I've called the first sexual revolution. That is where the origins lie of our modern Western ways of living and thinking about sex. Now, this sexual revolution didn't just come about on its own. It was part of very big social and intellectual changes that began to transform Western society in the 18th century. And the biggest social change was the rise of cities. Until this point, until about 1700, most people in Europe lived in small villages in the countryside. But this is the point at which that begins to change. And in Britain, for example, in 1700, only about 15% of the population lives in a town. But if you look 150 years later, by 1850, the majority of the population, most people in Britain, by that point, live in cities. And especially dramatic was the expansion of London. This is the point at which London explodes. It becomes the biggest city on the globe. By 1800, more than 1 million people live there. So the creation of sexual freedom is partly bound up with the creation of new ways of living, the creation of modern city life. And intellectually, the sexual revolution is part of the great Western Enlightenment of the 18th century. This is the point at which, first of all, people stop being so scared of God and worried about God's vengeance and his anger and his punishments, and instead start to think about God very differently. They start to think that God is actually essentially happy and essentially friendly and essentially distant. God has made the world and set it in motion, but now he just looks on from afar. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't punish people. He's just happy to let them get on with things. And there's a similar new optimism in the Enlightenment about human nature, about what people are really like. A great optimism that human beings have the capacity for themselves to decide what's right and wrong. Instead of listening and relying and only following the Bible or the priests or the church, it now comes to be argued that actually every human being within themselves has the capacity to decide how to live their life, using their conscience and their reason, and by looking around them and seeing what is natural. Because if something is natural in the world, that means that God has made it like that for a reason. And if God has made it and allowed it, then human beings should do so too. And sex is quite a natural thing. And the third very important thing about the Enlightenment is that the 18th century is the first time that women's voices break through into the public sphere, as poets, as playwrights, as novelists, as philosophers, as readers and writers of all kinds. This is the moment in Western history where women's voices start to be heard for the first time on a large scale in public. And this rise of female voices and feminist arguments changes Western culture forever. So this is where modern sexual freedom began, both in theory and in practice. And in practice, we can see there's a huge explosion in the amount of sex outside marriage that people are having. If we look in England, in the 1650s, at the height of sexual discipline, fewer than 1% of all children are born outside marriage. But 150 years later, after the first sexual revolution, that has exploded to almost 25% of firstborn children being born outside marriage. And by 1800, almost 40% of women getting married in England are already pregnant. So there's a huge, a seismic shift in how people actually behave. And this is also the point at which people start to think very differently about sex. It's where the modern principle of sexual freedom is born. For the first time, people start to argue seriously that sex is actually a private matter, and that consenting adults have the right to do what they like with their own bodies. And sex is increasingly celebrated from this point onwards as not just any old pleasure, but a very, very important part of human existence. There's a great line by the poet and politician John Wilkes, who wrote in 1754, "Life can little more supply than just a few good fucks, and then we die." And I love that quote, not just because it's quite funny, but because it's not just about sex. He's making an argument about the most important things in the whole world. He's making an argument about the whole purpose of life and the role of sex and sexual pleasure in that. And that's a very Enlightenment kind of outlook. But the last thing I want to tell you about the first sexual revolution that began in the 18th century is that it's very, very unequal and biased. And one important part of that is that it sees a great change in ideas about the sexuality of men and women. Now, until this point, through the whole of Western history, until the 18th century, it's always been presumed that women were the more lustful sex, that women were more promiscuous, more passionate, more seductive than men. And from this point onwards, that idea gets completely turned on its head. From the 18th century onwards, people start to argue and presume that actually men are much more sexual than women. Men are naturally promiscuous. Men need to have a lot of sex a lot of the time, probably with a lot of different women. But women are not like that. Women are much less sexual. Perhaps women are actually naturally asexual, and definitely women are chaste. So this great imbalance between the sexuality of men and women that becomes established in this new way of thinking has a tremendous effect on Western culture from the 18th century onwards. We're still living with those presumptions. So why should you care about all this? What has the history of sexual freedom got to do with the world today? Well, let me tell you. The first reason is that this is a story that began 300 years ago, but it's still unfinished, especially in respect of the sexual rights of women and of same-sex relations. And we still, within the Western world, disagree very strongly about all sorts of important sexual questions and about the limits of sexual freedom, about abortion and pornography and gay marriage and all sorts of other questions. And that disagreement and that divergence of opinion and that plurality of voices is itself an important part and a healthy part of our modern Western condition. But the second reason to care is that outside the Western world, the situation is very different. There are many cultures around the world today where men and women, and especially women, are not free to do what they like with their own bodies, where people still are punished and flogged and imprisoned and sometimes even executed for having sex outside marriage. So much of the world is not for sexual freedom. Much of the world is against sexual freedom. So I want to end with this simple thought, which I hope will inspire you. Sexual freedom is like democracy. Now, everyone can see that democracy is not natural. Democracy is a great human invention. And everyone can see that democracy is not perfect, far from it. And everyone can see that it's fragile and that it doesn't exist in much of the world. And we can all agree that democracy is worth fighting for and preserving and advancing. We shouldn't take it for granted. Sexual freedom doesn't exist in large parts of the world. Sexual freedom is imperfect and fragile. And it's not simple. It leads to all sorts of problems. Well, freedom is always complicated and difficult. With freedom comes responsibility. But sexual freedom is also a good thing. Sexual freedom brings people happiness. It's better than sexual punishment and sexual repression. It's better than a culture in which the community or the church or the state decides what people can and can't do in their own bedrooms. And that's why we shouldn't take sexual freedom for granted. We should stand up for it, we should celebrate it, we should help advance it, and we should understand where it comes from. Thank you.